This is Richard Vague with Tychos. Today we want to talk about governments that have a big stake in the private sector. Let's start by taking a look at central government debt, especially Japan's, which registers in at 207% of GDP, far higher than in any other country of the Big Seven. Here we see the 6 countries within the Big Seven that are democracies, so not including China. However, that 207% is a little misleading because Japan's government uses some of that debt to buy financial assets. Over time, it has acquired a large holding of assets, most of which are stocks and bonds, totaling a whopping 60% of GDP, including stock in private sector companies. In contrast, the U.S. government owns very little, at 15% of GDP, and that's mainly student loans. So now let's subtract the financial assets these governments own from their financial debt to look at the net debt, which is a truer picture of each government's debt. Again, Japan is the highest, but at 150% of GDP, not quite as attention-grabbing as the first chart. And the European countries, since they own a lot of financial assets, look much lower than the U.S. Why has Japan's government acquired such a large amount of financial assets? To prop up financial markets, especially in and after a crisis, something it has been doing in a large way ever since the massive financial crisis in Japan of the 1990s. In fact, for many of these countries, financial calamity has been the context and catalyst for this intervention. For the economy as a whole, if we look at the 2 largest categories of financial assets, all debt plus all stocks, another word for equities, expressed as a percent of GDP, it is evident that they have grown astronomically in the past 50 years. From 280% to 720% of GDP in the U.S., and from 160% to 730% in Japan. In China, which has only recently entered the market economy, it has gone from an indeterminate but presumably de minimis amount to 660% of GDP. More on China in a moment. Because financial assets, these equities and this debt, has become such a large percentage relative to the size of the economy, it really just makes it easier and more understandable that governments are beginning to own some of these assets. If we take another look at just the U.S. and Japan governments, what is striking is the very fact of such large ownership of financial assets by the Japanese government, especially the ownership of equities. It is a rather profound blurring of the line between the government sector and the private sector. So now let's look at these same charts for the total government sector with China added in. Here's the total government debt chart. China clearly has been catching up to the rest of the world on the government debt side, though it still has a ways to go. Note that for the following charts, we also include the totals for local and central governments for all countries. Here's the government's financial assets chart, and here we see the profound difference of an ostensibly communist country. China owns a lot more assets than the democracies, more than even Japan, especially on the equity side. This includes, by definition, the state-owned companies. What is worth noting, though, is the shrinking gap between China and Japan. These are 2 profoundly different countries and economic ideologies, but at least as regards the state ownership of financial assets, the difference between the 2 countries is narrowing. Given that, it is perhaps worth asking, especially in the case of Japan, if the state owns private sector assets, does that create a conflict of interest? Will governments be tempted to act to enhance or preserve the value of these assets, even when it conflicts with the interest of citizens? It's not unreasonable to ask that question, nor is it unreasonable to think that governments will intervene to own even more financial assets over time, especially when called on to prop up markets. Finally, we look at the net debt, and again, the difference in China is profound. China's government net debt is negative here, meaning government actually has a large positive net worth, whereas all the democracies have a negative financial net worth. That's because China's government owns assets that in other countries are largely owned instead by households. The government ownership of state-owned enterprises in China is in lieu of household ownership of the stock of those companies. Given that, the comparative net worth of households and businesses among the Big Seven is something we will explore to understand this difference a little more fully in a future video. That's it for this week. Thanks.